Okay, tonight we're talking uncaught type error. If you've written any code, you've probably seen it, you probably hate it. Let's try to get our heads around it. So when do we see uncaught type error? As we have here, I've opened a new page in my browser. It's a page that you get in any browser, and it's just handy for writing console stuff from scratch, as if I were in a text editor, but I can just do it directly in a browser. So again, if you want to get here, you open a new tab. It's about : blank, opens a fresh page. There's no content here. And I've opened the developer tools, which on Mac is Command Option I think it's Control Alt I on a PC. So when I do that, I get it open. And usually it starts on the Elements tab. I've got mine zoomed way in, so I'm on the console tab. So I'm going to close that out. So when do we see uncaught type errors? We see them if we attempt to use an expression that doesn't use the right type of data. So first of all, what different data types are there in JavaScript? You've got Booleans, numbers, strings, objects, arrays, these two seemingly similar variable values called null and undefined. So these are different types of data. And in your code, if you are writing something and you're expecting one type, but either that's not there or it's actually a different type, you'll get a type error. So one example is, let's say we're working with a string and we want to do something with that. Strings are objects, so we can put a dot here, and here are all sorts of properties that we could technically call on this object. But if we attempt to do something that isn't in this list, like barf, you'll see it's undefined. And check the microphone, should be working. Let me test. Ringtone, I'm speaking. Yep. So sorry, Max, but it might be you, buddy. Okay, so if I do robert.barf, then I get undefined. If I try to call robert.barf, I get an uncaught type error. Why do I get this? Because robert.barf is not a function, because I didn't put it on this string, so it's not even available. So I am attempting to call a function that doesn't exist. So that is a type error. I'm attempting to access this property as if it is a function, but it is undefined, and you can't call undefined. So it's a type error. Why is it uncaught? It's uncaught because in JavaScript, you can have a try-catch block, and that's how you attempt to run code. And if there is an error anywhere in the code that you run, it will catch it in the catch block. So if I were to write it all on one line, I could say try, and then robert.barf, calling it, and there's the end of my try block. And if any of that code fails, I then catch it, and catches a function and expects any errors. So if I catch it, I can then console.log those errors. So that you'll never really see it written in one line, but for brevity's sake, here it is in one line. And if I now run this, we'll get a type error, but it's no longer uncaught because I am catching it. Hence the uncaught, well, I caught it, so it's not uncaught. It's still a type error, but I am catching it. So that is the simplest example of one possible type error. This one is that it's not a function. There are many different type errors, and they're all errors on you attempting to do something with an object or a piece of data that is not the correct type, and therefore the operation you're attempting to perform on it, it can't do it because it's not the right type. So let's try some more examples. So if I create an object thing, and it's an object. So thing equals object. Cool, I've got thing. Thing is an empty object, okay? Well, if I try to access a property on thing called something, we can see that it's undefined. So again, if I attempt to call it, I get that same error. Thing.something is not a function. Okay, we just saw that. We know something is technically undefined and we're trying to call it. Okay, well, what about if we attempt to, let's see here, if we attempt to, I'm going to look at a couple of examples here. Let's say we don't have an object, so we just have var obj. And with var obj, I'm not setting it to anything. It's just going to be, it's actually going to be undefined. So if I run that command var obj, I have initialized obj, and any variable that you create but don't set to anything immediately by saying equals whatever will be set to undefined, the special value in JavaScript called undefined. So obj is rightfully so undefined. It's not null, it's undefined. But if I now attempt to do something to obj, like set some sort of property, and already we're seeing I can't read property foo of undefined. Again, obj is undefined. Undefined has no properties, so I can't literally access this property. That's why I'm getting this type error. If I attempt to set it to something, actually, well, that probably will work. But if I even attempt to call it, that gives me a slightly different error, cannot read property foo of undefined. So I guess they were both the same thing. I can't access this property called foo on obj because it's undefined. So again, I'm trying to use dot notation to access a property of an object, but I can't use dot notation on something that is a stand-in for undefined. Let's see here. What else have we got? If something doesn't even exist yet, so I have not yet declared a thing called Baz. Baz doesn't technically exist. So if I attempt to, let's see here, call something on it, name, then I try to set it equal to 0, this is actually a reference error because Baz isn't even defined. So not quite a type error, but different error because I haven't even told the current execution context, the current global namespace. I haven't told it what Baz is, so Baz is not defined. But we're in type errors, so my bad, that's a reference error. So living a property, and I know you're seeing this. So here are a couple of things that I'm doing as examples to generate some of these type errors. But ultimately, like how do you come upon these type errors? When are you most likely to encounter them? You're most likely to encounter them if you're using any of the big frameworks, Angular, React, Vue, Ember. Most of them, you have to manage state somehow. So when your app loads, when the screen loads, the app is in its default current state where it's likely not made any API calls to get the data that you need to actually show stuff on the page. And in those cases, if you're not careful, those objects that you're attempting to likely iterate through and loop over and do that sort of thing, if you're not careful, they might be undefined when you first start. And all the code that will run on it when they're really an array or an object is going to run when they're also they could be undefined. So in such a case of like React, let's say, or really any of them, you usually have some sort of state object. And that state object is an object that you can put properties on. And if you don't initialize those properties to things like arrays or objects, then they will instead be initialized to undefined. And therefore, in any of your subsequent loops or event handlers or anything like that, and you attempt to loop over them, well, if you're not careful and you don't first check to see whether they are of the data type that you are expecting, you're going to get these sorts of type errors. You're going to get type error, blah, blah, blah is not a function, or it's not a property, because what it's trying to do when the page first loads is access these properties of undefined and not of the object that they should be. So that's usually the biggest place, is like you might try to call something r.length, and you'll get a type error that doesn't have length because you're attempting to access the length property of some sort of object in state that, because an API call hasn't returned yet, because the page just loaded and the API call is being fetched, there is no array there yet, unless in your state, again, might be an object, you say R is an empty array. And then now it has a length property, it's just 0. So you won't see anything, but you won't get a type error. So that's the biggest kind of, the biggest thing to be on the lookout for. So if we so that's the first one, is just generally be aware of what data you're operating on in each expression or declaration at the time you are truly trying to access it. So that's just the biggest one. Now, there's a whole subset language of JavaScript, and it's called TypeScript. And it's becoming much more popular, and that's because it attempts to kind of subvert these specific type errors. In it, you have to declare what types of data you're working with in every situation, in every expression, function, statement. And it requires you to state that so that you can use debuggers better, more effectively. You can use linters more effectively, and they can catch when you're attempting to do something with data that maybe you shouldn't be. So if you don't use TypeScript, you run into these errors right here where JavaScript is dynamically typed. Things can change type all they want to. I can literally say obj, I'm going to set it to an object, and in the next line I can set it to a string. And so obj has just changed data types. And so that could be bad, that could be good. Usually it's bad. Once you declare something, you don't want it to change the type of data that it is. You want it to only grow, or like an array. You only want to add things or remove things from it. You don't want to change an array to a string. That'd be pretty bad. So be on the lookout, again, for changing of data types, not having them. TypeScript is a language designed to avoid these sorts of type errors, so feel free to look into it. What are some other tips? So TypeScript is great. If you hate the whole uncaught part, generally speaking, you should just be using try-catch more in your code. Anywhere where it's possible that an operation could fail, you should be kind of wrapping that in a try block and then catching it somehow later on in your code. And at least if you approach it from a test-driven developer's perspective, you will start adopting that mindset of kind of putting try-catch blocks where they're supposed to go so that it will actually catch type errors and you won't have anything uncaught, because you generally want to avoid uncaught things. What else have we got? I mean, again, the general takeaways here are when you're writing code, you may or may not realize that you're writing asynchronous code, and we covered that in a previous lesson of like when is my data actually going to be what I expect it to be? Does it rely on some call to another server, to a different service to happen and then come back? Well, if that's the case, then you should initialize that data to be an empty something of what you expect it to eventually be. So if you eventually expect it to be an array of things, don't just initialize it to undefined or not initialize it at all. You should initialize it to an array, and then somewhere in your template or your view, make sure that you're only rendering something if that array has a length on it. Because if it doesn't, it'll be 0, it'll go to true, and then or false, and then you won't see that piece of that widget render in your template, and you can handle something like an empty state. But don't neglect to initialize any data in your potentially single page applications, progressive web apps, that sort of thing. But otherwise, make sure that you just know and can feel confident in any part of code that you're writing. So if you have super nested objects, or you're doing a lot of chaining of methods, just know at each point whether you can access that specific property and whether it's going to give you a string, a number, an object, a function. Know what it's going to give you back and know what it is expecting so that you don't get uncaught errors. Because believe me, time and time again, I've had something like obj.something else, and I'd call it, and then I'd expect something back, and I'd get length. But I get one of these type errors to say, hey, it turns out this right here doesn't exist, it was undefined. Or it was a number, and you were expecting to call a function on a number, but somewhere in my head I thought it was an object and it wasn't. So that's big. And I think the last thing that I want to cover, where you can really get these sort of uncaught or even caught type errors, is anytime you're using the word this. This, if you don't fully understand it, can seem finicky, or is that the right word, finicky? Odd, wacky, especially when you're using this in combination with any sort of asynchronous programming, callbacks, promises, async await, that sort of thing. So if you're ever doing this and you're trying to access something on this, you need to know what this is actually going to be when it's going to get run. And if there's any ambiguity there, odds will be that you'll end up with some sort of type error, because different browsers may interpret this keyword and the object that it eventually stands in for differently. So anywhere in your code that you see this, unless you're like a true senior developer who fully understands what this keyword entails, what it will be in different contexts, odds are this may be the culprit of some of your type errors. So definitely kind of want to leave you with that. I know this was a fairly short lesson, but really some of these things are, I was just typing these in because I found a great little article on Rollbar, I guess, of just the top 10 JavaScript errors from tons of projects. And I think about 5 or 6 of them are uncaught type error, undefined, type error, null is not an object. That one doesn't really count here. Another type error, another type error. So there's this recurring pattern of in 1,000+ projects, they found a lot of type error. And hopefully in me describing it to you, you'll now see that it's whenever you attempt to call something or reference something on what you might expect to be an object, but is likely that it's not an object yet, or it never was an object or never will be an object because you're not operating on the precise data type that you think you're operating on. So hope that was helpful. Enjoy coding. Hopefully you won't get too many type errors. Even if you do, I hope now fewer of them will be uncaught. Remember that, and hope you enjoy. So I think, let's see here. Yeah, I think we can conclude it there. Enjoy, everybody.